many stories out there of strength, resilience, and courage, and we're on a mission to bring you them all. Welcome to Empowered Voices Amplified, a migrant story.
Our guest today is Christine Mudavanhu, founder and lead consultant at Utano Global, a one-stop shop for all your diversity, equity, and inclusion management consulting requirements. She founded Utano Global because she truly believes that our differences is always the advantage we bring to organizations. Christine is an award recipient from Women in Technology in the Lifting Communities category. Welcome to the show, Christine.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you for having me.
We might just jump straight into it. So I've got my first question for you, which we ask everybody on this show is, when did you move to Australia and what made you decide to move here?
Oh, geez. I'll give you the sanitized version.
We'll prize the rest out of you later.
My move, originally when I left Zimbabwe in 2000, which was pretty soon after finishing high school, not too long after that. I was in my 20s when I left. And we actually, at the time I was married, so we had visas to come to Australia. We took a detour because we had some really, really good friends who are our family who were in New Zealand at the time, and we were planning the whole move overseas with them. So they had settled in New Zealand and they thought New Zealand was a lovely place to have a family. But at the time, we weren't sure New Zealand was for us. So we actually had visas for Queensland. At the time, my ex-husband had a visa to study at UQ University. That's where he was going to do his master's. But our 6-month detour turned into 10 years and one child later. And so I was in New Zealand for 10 years. And then I was at a crossroads in my life. I was entering a new phase in my life. And I was also trying to figure out who I was at that point in time. So I then decided that I wanted to be happy in a place where the sun always shone. So Brisbane seemed like a good place. I didn't know anyone. So I got on a plane and came here.
Fantastic. So apart from the sun always shining, what other expectations did you have before you moved to Australia and Queensland?
I think I knew enough about Australia because I'd lived in New Zealand for 10 years. I'd been here on holiday. So it wasn't as though Brisbane was completely foreign to me. Obviously, from a living perspective, it's one thing to come here as a tourist, go to the Gold Coast, and then to come here and move. And at the time, there was quite a number of people that were migrating from New Zealand to live here. As you know, with the visa requirements as a New Zealand citizen, you just need to get on a plane pretty much to come here. So one of the miracles of my journey overseas is I've never really had to deal with the visa debacle that a lot of my fellow migrants have had to deal with. My journey in that space has been fairly straightforward and fairly simple. So when I moved here, the attraction was, firstly, I didn't have to do anything in terms of from a visa perspective, and it kind of seemed like the next natural progression. And there was quite a big migration from people that I knew here. So I wasn't the only one in my peer group that was migrating at the time. So we were all kind of in this space of trying to figure out, well, New Zealand feels a little bit small. Where is the next step? And Australia was kind of like that next logical step for myself. I had a lot of family in Melbourne at the time. And given where I was at that point, I had a young child. I also had a 15-year-old, my sister's daughter, who is my other daughter. And so at the time, Melbourne kind of made sense. But Melbourne weather is very similar to Wellington, which is where we lived. And I'd been sick for 10 years in Wellington, and I wasn't about to be sick anymore. I wanted to be a place where I could breathe. So Brisbane seemed to tick a lot of those boxes from a health perspective as well, just in terms of how I could manage my high sensitivity to pollen. Having high sensitivity to pollen and moving to Wellington was maybe not a great life choice, but I didn't actually know that at the time when I moved there from Zimbabwe. So Brisbane ticked a lot of boxes from just generally, Melbourne was a no from the weather. Sydney just didn't seem like quite the place that I wanted to be at. And there were also some other things that were happening at that point that made Brisbane a lot more attractive. So that's how I came to be here.
Has it worked out for you? How's it gone with the health and the environment and everything else?
I'm smiling. It has definitely worked out. So I'm really happy here. It's the city was just really, really welcoming when I got here. I remember I said to a close friend of mine, when I came to Brisbane, I was searching for happiness. I was searching for a sense of belonging. I was searching for a sense of identity. And I've been here over 15 years now, and I'm very comfortable in Queensland. I'm very comfortable in my own skin here. I feel like everything I need to support me to achieve the things that I want to achieve is here.
What about leaving Zimbabwe, leaving home, leaving traditions and the ways of life? Is there anything that you miss, or because you have family and friends here, you just enjoy the selected parts that you choose to?
Oh, look, for me, now a bit of backstory. I grew up in a little town called Tegutu, which basically has less than 5,000 people. I'm joking. There were more than that. But we had no traffic lights growing up. I was getting out. Like, there was no planet I was not getting out of that small town. So I always had this sense that I wanted to leave home. So for me, it wasn't a massive culture shock moving overseas. And Zimbabwe is very Anglo-Saxon. We're a former British colony. So a lot of the things you would expect in a Commonwealth country, I got in New Zealand. I mean, look, the diet was a little bit different, but now, I mean, you can get the staples. We soon figured things out. So it wasn't for me as much of a culture shock. The distance, though, was a bit shocking. Like when you went back home, it's like, oh, gee, I actually live quite far. And I think I felt it the most when my dad passed away and I was trying to get out of the country as quickly as possible. And there was just no quicker way to get me there than 15, 16 hours later. And when you're grieving and you're going through that process, that's when it kind of sort of hits you that, okay, I live very far. So from a culture shock, the Maori culture has aspects that can easily be related to in our own Zimbabwean culture. But I was more looking for who can I connect with, who I've never met, who can I embrace, who I would not have ordinarily seen at home. So I was very much deliberately trying to get into circles that were different to me. And I think that's where the whole interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion came from. I was really trying to learn, how do other people think? And where, what experiences have you had that I can learn from? What can you expose me to? So had a plethora of friends from different backgrounds. And that was just my personality. I don't find it difficult to connect with strangers, no matter your class, no matter your race, no matter your ideologies and your beliefs, because I believe there's a space for everybody in this world. And as long as you respect my space and I respect your space, we can find a way to coexist. And so with that philosophy, I approach newness with an openness as to how can this place grow me. The things that I missed, particularly when I was pregnant, I missed pumpkin leaves. Now, in my culture, pumpkin leaves, it's amazing the things you miss from your childhood. My mom had a certain way. Now, I know in New Zealand cuisine, pumpkin leaves are not eaten. The butternut or the pumpkins are eaten. It's mostly butternut leaves. So we have a particular delicacy that we make, and that was my favorite growing up, right? And I hadn't had it, and there was nowhere where I could find, and that was the one thing I wanted when I was pregnant, and it was the one thing I would look for. So that bit I missed a bit. I quite a bit because I just couldn't get it. And then the irony of it is, after I'd given birth, I think when my son was a few weeks old, there was an area called Porirua and those of you who are familiar to New Zealand would know, and I found the pumpkin leaf, when the craving had gone. I was like, whatever.
It's not worth getting pregnant for all over again, just to use.
No, we weren't trying that experiment again.
Oh dear. You touched on your passion for equity and diversity and what you do. So working in that space, why is it so important to you? Why do you do it?
To be honest, my work in this space has just grown organically. And I've had to, over time, really come back to address that question of why. So, like I said to you, it's very easy looking back to say, okay, this was probably what triggered it. There was no one like defining decision point, right? There was just accumulation of a series of events and a series of self-actualizations around, some advantages that I myself have been able to have that have allowed me to do certain things, that have allowed me to try certain things, and kind of wondered, well, why was that? I remember a long time ago, and this is going to sound non-PE, but we will go there. We are in Empowered Voices, and I am being authentic here.
Yes.
So somebody said to me, and people don't troll and take this the wrong way, you need to understand the context. So I was having a conversation with a very close friend of mine, and she was talking. She kind of said to me in a joking manner, "You're very comfortable around white people." So I was like, "What?" So initially I was like, what does that mean and why? So it was kind of like, but because of the relationship, it was kind of like, I kind of had to go away and think about that. Like, it was said in a joking way, but it was something that I had to go away and think about it later. And I was like, what did that mean? Like, why would somebody say that? Like, what going? And you start that defense mode in your head,
Yeah.
and then I realized, and then I took a breath, and I was like, okay, hang on, let's layer it down here. What's behind the question? What was this person trying to really find out? This person was trying to find out that in a minority setting, right, even when you're yourself, you can still find the space to be yourself. So that was the proper question that was being asked, right? So to put it into context, right? So there was no racial connotations around it, none of that. It was really just to get a sense of understanding that you're okay with being yourself regardless of the context. And I learned that the reason why stemmed back to the skills that I developed really early on. So like I said, I grew up in a small town called Chegutu. There's a school called Bryden, and I light up because that was the joy of my childhood. I have such good memories of my junior school. We were the first cohort of, I think it was grade twos. I'll have to ask my mother which year twos in, or year one, whatever it was. But when the school opened, we were the kids that opened. And there was probably about 5 African children in that school. Everybody else was white. And so that was pretty much my existence in junior school. The cohort grew a bit more, as the school opened up, as more people came. But it was largely a white dominated school in terms of race. The same experience, I went to Watershed College, and the same experience, again, it was a groundbreaking school. It was a farm school. So I kept going from one farm school to another farm school. Don't know what my parents were trying to tell me. Didn't learn in the city. But again, it was the same experience where I was in a minority as in my own race. And so I learned the skills of being comfortable. And if you grew up in Zimbabwe, post-independence Zimbabwe, which I did grow up in, but remember, this is early post-independence Zimbabwe, where the segregation still exists, but it's starting to be on economic basis, right? So, and geographical basis, because, when people talk about segregation and, in independence, the wrongs and the injustices don't just, you flick a magic wand and they, they're all go and everybody's on a level
They're gone.
playing field and it's kumbaya and we're all great. And, and you don't necessarily just put children of color in a school that is dominated by, what is the minority in the nation, but they're the majority in that school environment. And like in my school, their parents were paying for the school because it was the farmers in the local area that built that school. So you don't necessarily then change the dynamic that created that injustice in the first place. So the racism was real. I always joke and say I learned that I was Black when I was 13 and I hit high school, because in junior school, we were a tiny cohort, tiny farming community. I used to tan. I know everybody's going to have comments about that. And I used to go, oh, I've got a tan line to my friends when we were crazy. But so for me, I just did what my friends were doing. So it's like,
I mean, you
oh, let's
can.
suntan. Yes, because I can, And then I got to high school. I learned, no, you don't do that. And so that's when I got educated into, my race fully. It's not that I was oblivious to the fact that I'm an African person. Of course, I knew that. That's not what I'm saying. But in the sense of what that means, in sense of, the divide that creates, in sense of sometimes it being an us and a them and all of that, I really started to learn a lot of that in my childhood years. So coming in as an adult, I was also raised by a father who taught me that, I belong wherever I choose to belong. And so I didn't grow up with a sense of feeling my brother had any title to anything that I didn't have, if that makes sense. So I didn't grow up. I had the privilege of growing up in a household where both genders were treated equally. Like my two brothers didn't get a superior education to the 5 girls. If anything, we got a superior education because my dad used to joke and say, I want to invest in my girls because they'll take care of me. But on a serious note, I didn't grow up thinking that my brother was more entitled to success and more entitled to anything than I was. Sure, was there the hierarchy of sometimes he didn't do chores and I did? Of course. They were. But in terms of from an education perspective, in terms of a leadership and the things and the spaces that I could occupy, no, I didn't feel that. So when in Zimbabwe there was the Beijing movement, and Magnus, you will probably remember this, there was a cohort of women that went to the Beijing summit that talked about gender equity. There was this revolution that happened around the country, and a lot of terminology around women empowerment, around, women's rights and all of that used to be coined. Hey, don't bring Beijing here. It became a conversation opener for some of the broader inequities that maybe, as a young child, you're oblivious to, like our Aurora system and the way it works and the way, daughters-in-laws are made to be subservient. That wasn't my experience. I was actually quite spoiled in that sense, in the sense that the family I was married to, although the broader family would have those, the immediate nuclear family, I was just another part of the family. I wasn't expected to do more housework. I wasn't expected, if anything, I was expected to do less. I was like a golden egg because I was the only one, and I was only ever going to be the only one because they had one son. So my mother-in-law at the time, oh yeah, and she was very clear. She told me, you and I have to be friends. Like, she was the best, and I say was because unfortunately she passed away, but she was like, you're the only one that I'm ever going to have. So you and I have to be friends. So to her, I was precious. I was something to be cared for, right? Whereas I know that, and in our culture, that wasn't the experience of the average. So it was, I guess, I use those examples as that's when you realize that, okay, so there is a divide here. And then moving into the workplace, I worked in Queensland government for a very long time, right? I also worked in New Zealand government before that. My background is public policy. My discipline is strategy and policy. So I realized as I was climbing through the ranks that the air is very thin up there in terms of, even though there's a lot of women, but in terms of women that look like me, nothing. And I remember in the department at the time, there was myself and, a lovely lady from Nigeria. And so we were friends. And I remember we used to celebrate if we saw another person of color, in leadership rooms, because we were the only managers at the point of color. I remember there was a lovely lady, a Kenyan lady who came, and she was an EA to one of our directors. So we didn't know her rank at the time. We didn't know anything about her. So she was in the lunchroom. And I remember texting Timmy. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's somebody else in the building. And she came. And so we're busy okay, did you get her name? Did you get her details? Only for us to find out she was a temp. She was the EA. She was filling in. She was from a temp agency. And I'm like, oh, fuck at that. And so it's kind of like having that sense of, okay, why are there so few of us? And I remember at the time when I was working for the department, I developed a close relationship with one of the deputy director generals. Now, if you understand government and its hierarchies. DDG is kind of like the 2IC to the person running the department. And her and I, we started doing a mentoring program at QUT for African students. And so I developed a program that was called How to Land a Job in the Public Sector. And she was the keynote speaker for that. And so QUT, I joined their career mentoring program because my niece, who I was speaking to, used to go to QUT, and her friends used to get mentoring advice from me. And I was like, doesn't the university do this? But their parents were spending thousands and thousands of dollars. Again, another inequity is spending thousands and thousands of dollars, and their children couldn't actually get careered, right? And they didn't know how to network. So I started opening up my networks. I did a lot of things with QUT at the time, and then UQ and Griffiths, so a lot of the universities, and that was focused on skill. So that's when a lot of my pro bono sort of structured work in that equity space really started, where I was really passionate on how do we open doors for these successful students. And my focus was always on economic empowerment, because I firmly believed if you're going to change anybody's story, if you change their earning power, you get to change their story. So in that space, what happened was myself and Kathy Taylor at the time, we did a workshop with students, African students. There were about 50, nearly about 7, I think there were about 100 people that came there. I don't think I'm exaggerating. We didn't end up just confining it to African students, because that was the initial target, migrants. But there was so much interest in the fact, like, you don't get a deputy director general coming to a university to talk to you about how to land a job in the public sector. Interestingly, Kathy hadn't been through the merit selection process that we had been through, so I had to educate her about that pretty quickly. I'd be like, yeah, this is what we had to do. And she's like, gosh, I wouldn't get a job now if I had to go through this. But, we talked through the hurdles that people had to go through. So in trying to really open doors and in trying to understand that you're in a position where you have access to people, you've had certain advantages, not all advantages, but some, and celebrating the few that I've had, because all of us have privilege in some way, shape, or form. But rather than focusing on what I don't have, focusing on what I do and how do I use that to amplify. So it was building that muscle, working with students, then, starting working with organizations like African Professionals of Australia Association, joining, committees like Multilink Community Services, of which I am the chair in Logan. And so really stretching and building that muscle and working with the Islamic Women of Australia Association and being a program that was specifically targeted at migrant women and how to teach them small business skills when they were struggling with the skill recognition framework and they had skills to contribute. So it's all these things that I've been doing over time in a personal and professional capacity. And a lot of the times at work, when I was working for government at the time, they knew me. I would be running off to some sort of talk around, inequity. I'd be running to some talk about empowerment, some talk about something. And then I'd have to come back and say, okay, how many conflicts of interest do I have to declare here? So I'm so glad I'm out of the public sector now, because I don't have to declare conflict of interest all the time or remain numb on podcasts like this, because I'm like, okay, I am in the public sector. I'm part of the Queensland government. There's certain things I can and cannot say. I learned so many skills in that space, and I am so grateful to my colleagues in government, the leaders that I had in that space, because had they not bought into giving me space to be able to actually participate, like when I look back, I'm like, oh, wow, I actually did participate and do a lot of things outside of work. And I was raising my child, well, 2 of my kids at that point in time. But every other week, I was either doing something with like an ECCQ, doing something with African Professionals of Australia, doing something with skilled migrants. I had the privilege to host a summit that was funded by Department of Employment, Small Business and Training, which looked at a research report that was done by Deloitte on the opportunity cost of migrants not working in their profession. So my dear friend, Natasha Doughty, Emma, you met Natasha. She came to the Wood Technology Awards. She did that research when she was a partner at Deloitte. And so her and I worked on, how do we bring these figures and this awareness around what the average skilled migrant worker actually looks like, which is a 35-year-old commerce student, female commerce student with a master's, with an MBA or some sort of master's in business and commerce and a bachelor's degree in commerce. So it didn't actually look like what people thought. And while English literacy is an issue, it wasn't an issue. So all these different platforms were coming in, and a lot of them I was creating out of this passion to answer this question: how do we get more women that look like me in spaces and rooms that, when we walk into, any of us walk into, they're not there, they're not represented. Because I knew so many women who were so smart and who are exceptionally smart, who can bring brilliant ideas, but for whatever reason, they're not in those rooms. And my quest in everything that I do is trying to answer the question why, and how do we educate, and how do we support, and how do we empower to bring more women into those rooms. Very long answer.
That was a good one. I'm fascinated.
Yeah, really good. You spoke about economic empowerment, and one of the things that you work on, you're the founding partner and director for Queensland at Migrant Women in Business. It's a social enterprise. I know definitely economic empowerment, and it's women, and you're passionate about that. But what have been some of the key learnings you've had working with a group of women running their own businesses?
Every day it's such a privilege. I cannot tell you. I've been doing this program, which started off what is now Migrant Women in Business. It's had so many iterations over the years to look at what it looks like. What it looks like now is a national organization, which I have the privilege of working with Luz Rasputo and Corinne Kemp on at a national level, so not just at a state level. But what I've learned from the women in that space is we have so much to give. We have so many ideas, and all women need is a door to be opened. And sometimes women don't even know where those doors are. So you can't open a door if the door is not even there. And so what I've learned is and the question that I've been asking myself is, how do I open the door for these amazing women to come through, right? And so what I've learned over the years is that never, ever underestimate anybody. Like nobody. You don't know anybody's story. You have no idea. So that was one of the first things I learned. I worked in domestic and family violence for a few years, domestic and family violence policy. I think that's what crystallized for me just the inequities and just the challenges that women face in terms of overcoming certain barriers. And I know economics doesn't solve everything. I absolutely know that 1000%. There are rich women who get abused. Like there's a whole different problem in that space. But if you're able to control your money, if you're able to make decisions around your money, the options that are open to you, not always, because it is extremely complicated. So there is no one size fits all here by any stretch of any imagination. And on Sisters in Color, I did a podcast with a domestic and family violence lawyer where we got into it. And up to today, it's still the highest ranking podcast. And so we really got into the nitty gritty of discussing how DV actually is what brings a lot of women down when your relationship is toxic, when the space that you feel safe is not supported. The chances of you being able to rise up on that is harrowing. It's very difficult. And what's even worse, when you have no money to your name, when you have no control over your source of income, the oppression levels. If you look around the world at the poverty rates of women, right? There's a book called Half the Sky. If you ever have time, read that. And it talks about women in third world countries, and it talks about, this huge marginalization, particularly from the point of maternal health, right? Because let's face it, how much money you have impacts the education that you have access to, right? Not all education is equal. And whether we want to acknowledge it or not, there is an economic divide, right? I have had the privilege of having the best that my parents at the time could afford, right? And which gave me great privilege to learn and be exposed. By the time I was 13, going overseas was not an if, it was a when, and it was a where, right? And that's a lot to do with the education that I was exposed to. A lot of kids didn't have that. So imagine the mindset I had at 16, 17, very different. And the things I was looking at, right? So your education, your health, right? Try getting great healthcare with no money. Try that, especially in a third world country. And even here, you find that there is a divide between the health resources that, somebody who is chronically ill can access, and they have great amounts of wealth, versus somebody who is just relying on what government will offer. There is a divide. Whether we choose to accept it or not, it doesn't change the fact that there is. So
It exists.
it affects your health. It affects the quality of life that you can provide for your children. It affects your mental health. It affects your relationship. A lot of the fights that people have in the home are about money, right? They're about bills not being paid, the lights off, all of this, right? And I could keep going to the list. And I'm not saying money solves everything. No, it never does. But I had to pick what is the key issue that I wanted to focus on. And the key issue I chose to focus on was, if I can help in any way, in a tiny way, and the women do all the story, all the work, please, by the way, the women I work with are the ones who deserve the absolute credit, right? They do all the work because you have to, right? Even if Christine's opening the door, you still have to get up and walk through that door. And sometimes the walk through that door may be the hardest and the longest walk that you've ever taken, but you still have to get up and walk through that door. So they absolutely do all of that work. But if they can do all of that work, and they can start to get the confidence that comes with knowing that I can actually get up and leave, right? And I can actually go and start a new life for myself on my terms. I can raise my kids on my terms. It changes what's possible for women. So that's what's been the biggest driver in economics. And what those women have taught me is that your life can absolutely change if your economic circumstances change. I've seen it proved time and time and time again.
Wow. What motivates you to keep pushing forward? In the face of challenges, everything that you've seen, what keeps you going?
Emma, I'd like to invite you to my class one of these days and come and meet the sensational women I get to see. And you'll be able to answer that question for yourself. When somebody comes to you with the level of trust that I've managed to build in my community, and I do not take that for granted. I protect that with every being of my body. If I need to show up for these women, 10, 20, I will show up for them because they trust me. And they trust me because we've built a relationship over time. If I refer them to somebody and somebody doesn't treat them well, you will never hear from me again, because these women are precious, right? And they're precious because when somebody comes to you with a dream, right? And I'm tearing up because I know the amount of dreams that people come, and they have conversations with me and they share things that are so intimate and so personal. And you extend an olive branch, and it might be as small as making somebody a cup of tea, but you care enough to listen, to say, how do I stand up and walk with you on this journey? I don't have the answers. I never have the answers going into my class, never. But we figure it out together, right? And how do we figure it out? And how do we support one another to grow? I don't ever want anything personally. My thing is, then how do you pay it forward to another woman? How do you give another woman that same level of support? So what keeps me going is that story has to change for another woman, right? And it has to keep changing, and it has to keep changing. And even if it's just one more story, right? It's one less story that won't change, right? And that story has to look different every single year. There has to be somebody who, a year, 2 years, even if I see you only once, can pick up the phone and say, oh my gosh, that contact that we had, this changed my life. That for me is what keeps me going, because the work that I've had the privilege to be able to do over an extended period of time, as organized, as chaotic as it has been sometimes, has led me to have a community of women who I know for a fact are in a better place. And that, to me, is what I think the sisterhood is all about.
Wow.
It's amazing.
Yeah, I'm blown away. You've touched on sisterhood, and you are the host of an inspiring podcast, Sisters in Color. So, where you shine spotlight on incredible journey of women of color in leadership. So, how do you find this ties together everything that you work on?
So Sisters in Color was really about changing the face of leadership. So remember, when I was working in the department, I kept going into rooms and not finding, these amazing women of color. And yet I knew they were there. I'm like, hey, come on, where are you? And so Sisters in Color is about giving a young girl a place where they can go and listen to a group of thought leaders in so many different places that are doing such amazing things, be it on a local scale, be it on a global scale. So we sit and we scour and we look for women. And a lot of these women, to be honest, I started off just talking to women in my circle. And I've been doing Sisters in Color for years. It was, I've got a YouTube video. I've got YouTube videos that are there, and where I've been talking to women. We used to call it Quite. We used to call it Migrant Women in Business Summit. Like, Sisters in Color has been evolving over time. I've been talking to women, and I love talking to women who are doing amazing things. So Sisters in Color is a passion project for me. Yes, I know, I'm trying to inspire young girls, and it absolutely does do that. But first and foremost, it feeds my soul. It feeds my soul to hear how women are breaking barriers, particularly in that leadership space, because that's where decisions are being made that are impacting the trajectory of the next generation's lives. So if by amplifying those voices, we can then get young girls to look up and say, well, that's possible for me. She's doing it. She's a neuroscientist. She's an entomologist. She's this, she's that. I can do that. There are people who look like me. And Will Smith said it the best when Barack Obama got elected as president of the United States. I've never forgotten what Will Smith said. He said, while I believe, Martin Luther's king, I believe, I have a dream speech. Everybody knows the I have a dream speech, right? It's like, we never actually believed it. He's like, there's a small part of you that's like, yeah, but you don't actually believe it. And I remember Barack Obama's, I don't know if you remember Barack Obama's inauguration, but there was this sense of whether he was going to be a good president or not, like that wasn't even on the radar. It was like, oh my gosh, this is actually possible. So the reality and the representation absolutely matters. So there's a lot that we're looking at doing with Sisters in Color, and how to actually amplify that voice of people who have stages that allow them to have voices, because then those voices, what I believe, right, will be the ships that raise the tide for the other smaller ships. So that's what Sisters in Color is for me.
You can't be what you can't see. That is so true. Christine, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining Sandra and I on Voices, on Empowered Voices Amplified. And it's been an absolute pleasure hearing you talk about, women empowerment and economic empowerment, amplifying voices that have something to say. So thank you again. If anyone wants to connect with you, what's the best place to find you?
I have to make you laugh. I didn't realize that LinkedIn, like people identified me with LinkedIn. Do you know the amount of times I've been at the beauty parlor, I've been at the supermarket, and because my hair is quite distinctive, right? The way I wear my hair at the moment.
Yes.
I've had people walk up to me, and a lady the other day, no lie, at the beauty parlor goes, I know you. And I'm like, oh, no, you don't. And she's like, yes, I know you. You're Christine from LinkedIn. And I was like, what? She's like, yes,
wow.
I listened to your LinkedIn post. And I was like, so LinkedIn is the best place to find me, because apparently people know me through LinkedIn. it's also the place I post the most. There is Sisters in Color. There's a page on YouTube. Again, Utano Global. Our website is www.utanoglobal.com. You can access our podcast through that. Migrant Women in Business. Again, mwib.com.au. If you are a woman looking for a place to hang out on a Saturday morning, we also have free business classes running from between now and the rest of the year. So come hang out with us for 2 hours. It is an 8-week commitment though, so you have to be pretty committed to come to that. But yeah, the best place to connect with me is LinkedIn, and everything just kind of spirals from there. But thank you, Emma and Sandra, for having me and letting me rabbit on about the things that excite me, the things that give me energy. I really do appreciate being on this side of the podcast. Loved it. Thank you so much for opening your stage up.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yes, it's been a pleasure, Christine. And to our listeners, thank you again for tuning into Empowered Voices Amplified. If you have any questions or want to know more about what we discussed today, you can always send us an email. Thanks again and have a great week.